Let's continue talking about the vertebral column, spinal column. We left with an overview yesterday. We looked at the 26 bones. 26 or 32, depending on how you count. We'll look at that a bit in more depth today. The primary and secondary curves of the spinal cord, and I left you with the idea that how does the vertebral column flex and bend and extend and rotate? How is movement allowed in the vertebral column? And a lot of it has to do with the discs that separate each vertebrae, or each vertebra, rather. The discs that separate the vertebrae are intervertebral discs. They separate each vertebra from one another. They absorb shock. They resist gravity. They start at the second cervical vertebrae, so right at the top of the vertebral column, and all the way down until you reach the last lumbar vertebra above the sacrum. The way that these things are created or structured is a lot like a hockey puck, with an outer ring of tough fibrocartilage. So this has tough, dense fibers that allow flexibility, but for the disc to maintain its shape. Kind of like how duct tape has strands through it, so it makes it really tough, harder to rip. The outer fibrocartilage ring has a really soft jelly-like center in the middle. This soft nucleus is called the nucleus pulposus. It's a pulp-like, jelly-like center of fluid that just helps with cushioning and shock absorption. We don't care about what it's made of necessarily right now. And then on either end, the top and the bottom surfaces, the superior and inferior surfaces, smoother hyaline cartilage. Really tough hyaline cartilage that interfaces with the vertebrae proper. So each disc has this general shape, which can flex left to right, can allow a bit of rotation, can compress and thicken, allowing the articulation between sequential vertebrae in the vertebral column. And it's the combined effect of all of these in sequence, the 25, 27 vertebrae that are the intervertebral discs that we have, that allows the gradual, complete flexion or extension of the spinal column. So these will thicken and squish together over time. You can see how the degree of movability, the degree of flexibility highlighted here. Compression is obvious after just a normal day walking around, daily activities, fighting gravity, staying standing, or even sitting in your seats. The vertebral column is fighting gravity as you sit in your seats, even if you're leaning back. And after a long day of fighting gravity, the intervertebral discs can squish down. They're a lot thinner. They are worse at absorbing shocks in this configuration. Your back might get sore at the end of the day. Not yet. You guys are all still young. But it rebounds afterwards when you fall asleep. You lie horizontally, they're not fighting gravity, so the discs thicken again in preparation for the next day. And this is a cycle with every day that you walk around and spend a day on your feet. So it's commonplace to think that when you reach maturity and you have a stable adult height, that you start to shrink when you get older, that it's the discs that are at fault, but the true culprit of shrinking stature as you age is not in the discs that degrade, but the bodies of the vertebrae themselves degrade. The bone portion of the vertebral column starts to degrade. Now, it's not to say that the discs can't be injured. Slipped disc or fused disc, damage to the discs happens when under repeated strain, so repeated bad posture. I have a colleague that works back in Ontario that does research on the integrity of vertebral discs and posture. And if you always slump, think about it. You're slumping forward. You put a lot of pressure on the anterior portion of the discs, and the posterior portion bulges. Right? They're flexible. They can tilt. That's their job. But if they're always bulging at the posterior aspect, the fibrocartilage starts to unravel a little bit. And that jelly-like nucleus can spill out the back, and it loses all of its shock absorption. Long way to go until you worry about that. So the discs between vertebrae allow flexion, extension, rotation, and the combined effects allow the high degree of mobility that you have with the spinal cord. Now, the main part of today's lecture is centered on the vertebrae proper. I want to take time to identify the common parts of the vertebrae, and then by the end of this lecture, you'll be able to take one vertebra and identify what type it is. Maybe not the number, but you'll be able to say, is it cervical, is it thoracic, is it a lumbar vertebra, is it part of the sacrum or the coccyx? I'm going to point out a couple really notable features. You'll forget those right away, but even still, there's a quick and easy way for you to remember or recall which is which. So this is in preface. This is in preparation for that exercise. This is a general vertebra shown here. They all share the same general shape. The same general shape. They all have an enlarged body. The body is what stacks on top of the intervening vertebral discs and makes the column. This is what supports the weight of the body. You can maybe see through the shaded red here. Certainly on your slides you can see the surface looks rough. And it's that way purposefully to help secure the discs in place so they don't slide around on a smooth surface. A rough, thick, beefy, weight-bearing body. That's the anterior portion of the vertebra. The posterior portion is an arch. And the arch is made of three things. The arch has two pedicles. We've seen that word before when we talked about the cerebellum. Remember little feet? Little protrusions. They're not obvious, but they are the lateral aspects of the arch, and they're connected posteriorly by a lamina, which simply means thin surface or thin membrane. A lamina is a flattened portion that connects the two pedicles. Overall, the shape is an arch shape. We create a hole in the middle, which allows passage of the spinal cord. So we have the body that bears weight, the arch made of three things, the hole in the middle. Anyone want to take a stab at what that hole in the middle might be called? We've seen it, actually it's probably on here, isn't it? Yep, vertebral foramen. We've seen a word before, foramen, that means passageway through something, tube through something. Foramen, it's in a vertebra, so it's the vertebral foramen. That's where the spinal cord sits. Now, the things that aren't highlighted here are processes. Projections on the back of the vertebrae. There are two transverse processes sticking out to the side and one spinous process. The spinous process is what you feel if you try to palpate your vertebral column right now. That's the spinous process, or the spinous processes. You can't feel the transverse processes. They're buried. You can feel the spinous process. These are vitally important in providing attachments for muscles, and there are many muscles in the or that span the vertebrae and the vertebral column that allow you to flex and extend and rotate at every level of the vertebral column. So these are really important for maintaining posture and allowing muscle attachment to support and direct the vertebral column appropriately. So transverse off to the side, spinous in the middle. Those are the main features that we can see superiorly, but I want to take a quick look at this other picture that you have in your notes. It's sort of an oblique posterior view, because we haven't looked at yet how these fit together. The structures that we've looked at so far don't help us understand how the pieces lock together, how the vertebrae will fit together sequentially. It's the articular processes that are the lock and key for the stacked vertebrae. There are superior articular facets, and a facet is just sort of a concave surface. This little indentation, if you will. The superior surface points up for most of the vertebrae, but it's on the superior surface, and it will interface with the inferior articular facets of the vertebra above it. So every vertebra has a set of superior and inferior articular facets. The inferior articular facets interface with the superior articular facets of the vertebral bone that's next down the line. So there's the body with the arch and processes coming off of the posterior aspect, and now these things extend up and down, superior and inferior. And since they meet up with, they articulate with the vertebrae that are superior and inferior, they end up creating another foramen, another passageway. Not through the bone of the vertebrae itself, but this is artificial. It's a little opening that you can see. A really nice one is highlighted here. The inferior process articulating with the superior process makes a nice little passageway where the spinal nerves emerge. Spinal nerves, we talked about those at length. The different levels of the spinal cord give off pairs of spinal nerves. They emerge through this hole made by the articulation of sequential vertebrae. So the adjacent superior and inferior articular processes, the ones that touch, that connect, they create an intervertebral foramen. Between vertebral vertebrae, a hole or passageway that's between the vertebrae, and this allows the passage of spinal nerves out to the rest of the body to do whatever it is they need to do. And if you're curious, these are thoracic vertebrae. Doesn't say it anywhere, but I know these to be thoracic vertebrae. And we're going to start looking at what the characteristics are of each kind of vertebrae so that you can also identify this as easily as I just did. So let's start at the top and move down. Cervical vertebrae are at the top. Cervical vertebrae are the most superior. They are generally the lightest, the most finely structured. These ones don't have to hold a lot of weight. They only bear the weight of the skull and the brain and the structures of the head. They don't need to worry about supporting the upper limbs and the torso, so they are generally smaller in structure. These ones look fine, and they have the largest arches. The largest arches, the largest opening, the vertebral foramen are quite large as well, so that the spinal cord can pass through and give off many different branches. But that's not the easiest way to identify these. The easiest way is that the spinous processes are obviously different here than in the rest of the vertebral column. They have two little projections on the posterior tip, and we call those a bifid process. They have a bifid spinous process. There are two little bulges rather than one singular bulge in the rest of the vertebral column. So you see a bifid spinous process, automatically cervical vertebrae. That's a dead giveaway. This is the only location where some of the vertebrae don't follow the same general scheme. There are two really interesting candidates in this area. And if you haven't already, you'll look at these in lab. The atlas and the axis are the two most superior vertebrae that support the skull and allow a high degree of rotation, right? Think you can turn your head all the way to the left and all the way to the right really easily, largely because of the pivoting of the atlas on the axis. Let's take a quick look at the cervical vertebrae in a bit more depth. If you're presented with one magic unknown vertebra, you can tell this is a fairly light, finely structured vertebra, large vertebral foramen, bifid spinous process. Clearly it's cervical. Another interesting feature that we didn't see on the last slide is that these are the only vertebrae that also have holes next to the arches. There are other foramen which serve a purpose of transmitting vertebral arteries up into the brain, up to the skull. The rest of the vertebrae don't have these holes. So if you're lost and you can't identify the bifid spinous process, this is another way to identify these vertebrae. The majority of these, 5 or 6 of them, will have this structure. The two most superior are different. And cervical vertebrae number 1 is shown on the left. This is called the atlas. Atlas, after the Greek god that bore the weight of the world on his shoulders. The atlas bears the weight of the skull and the brain and all those important structures. It has dual arches and no body. The only vertebra to not have a body. Dual arches, anterior and posterior, and they are connected, they merge at what we call lateral masses. They're enlarged areas that do support the weight of the skull. It's not as clearly defined as the bodies of the other vertebrae in the vertebral column. They're enlarged lateral masses. These masses specifically bear the weight of the skull. So the skull sits right on top of those lateral masses. The superior surface, which is what we're looking at right here in this picture, would articulate with the inferior aspect of the skull. The skull would sit right on those two darkened blue-green squares. Now the articulation there allows a lot of flexion and extension. It doesn't help with rotation. Rotation is achieved when you put the atlas and the axis together. The axis is shown in these two pictures on the bottom. The axis has this obvious superior protrusion called the dens. The large vertebral foramen fits right over top of the dens, allowing a high degree of rotation between these two vertebrae. Otherwise, very similar structure. You can see the bifid spinous process. There's no transverse foramen obvious in this picture, the superior picture, but in the lateral view, you can see them. Pretty straightforward. If you're going to remember anything about cervical vertebrae, bifid spinous process, and that's your answer key. That's how you can tell these apart. And then clearly these two are different than the average cervical vertebra. Overall, though, fairly mundane, pretty boring description of cervical vertebrae. Thoracic is where it gets a bit more interesting. Thoracic vertebrae are somewhat more interesting. These ones are what make up the thoracic cage and start to make the thorax proper. This is where the ribs attach. So there are added features here that allow for the attachment of ribs. You can start to see these features shown over on the right-hand side. We'll talk about the head of the ribs and the tubercles of the ribs. Actually, I'll show you just quickly in a second with an inset picture. Tubercle is a word we haven't really heard of before. It's a roughened, raised portion of a bone. If a bone is generally just smooth and all of a sudden you see this mound, a roughened mound, it's likely a tubercle. Ribs have those, and they attach to or they articulate with thoracic vertebrae on the transverse processes. I'll show you how they fit together in a second. So thoracic vertebrae have facets where the ribs will articulate. They're called costal facets. Costal is a prefix that is specific to the ribs. We'll see costal cartilage associated with the ribs. Costal facets, indentations where the ribs articulate. And all of these highlighted circles are costal facets. Some of them are on the transverse processes, some of them are on the body or near the body at the pedicle. All of those indentations are costal facets. I haven't highlighted all of them for you. To put it in perspective with how the ribs will articulate with these thoracic vertebrae, I'm going to bring in this picture, which you don't see in your notes until later. But the costal facets would be these 2 points of attachment. You can see the head of the rib attaching just at the base of the pedicle, or articulating at the base of the pedicle. As the rib projects outwards and then encircles the thorax, we don't see the whole rib. But the tubercle, this raised, bumpy portion, articulates with the lateral surface of the transverse processes. And this happens on the left-hand side and the right-hand side. All the ribs connect like this. 2 points of attachment, one near the body, one at the transverse processes. Only the thoracic vertebrae have attachment points for ribs. So you see those facets? Thoracic vertebrae. If we zoom in a little bit, we can get a bit more detail about the facets. It's fairly clear the facet where the head of the rib attaches on the backside of the transverse process. That's not in question. What's a bit more difficult on this example specifically is where does the tubercle articulate? There are 2 demi-facets that make up the articulation point or the tubercle of the ribs. That is, the rib doesn't, or the tubercle doesn't attach to the body proper. It spans the section where the intervertebral disc would be. Two demifacets make the attachment point for the tubercle of the ribs. So there's a superior and an inferior, and a lot like the articular processes, the inferior of the vertebra just above this example would create the costal facet for the tubercle of the ribs. What else makes these vertebrae special? No bifid spinous process. The transverse processes here, you could argue, are a little bit blunted. They're not pointy. They're sort of rounded. But that's not unique to the thoracic vertebrae, so it's not an identifying feature. My gaze is drawn to the right-hand side, the right-hand example, because that clearly looks like something. What does that look like? What does this vertebrae look like? What's that? Hammer or an axe? I could see that, maybe. So are you holding it with the handle this way and then, yeah? Okay. That's not too bad. There's some creative license there. I like that idea. Once I tell you, you can't go back. It's so obvious. If you don't think that this looks like a giraffe, you're crazy. Thoracic vertebrae, giraffe heads. That's how you identify a thoracic vertebrae. Forget the blunted transverse processes. Forget the costal facets. If it looks like a giraffe's head, it's a thoracic vertebrae. So I'm going to rewind back in time real quick. Remember earlier in the lecture, I told you guys these are thoracic vertebrae? Boom, you know now. Giraffe heads. All right, let's see. Maybe there's something like that for the lumbar vertebrae. So we're progressing inferior through the vertebral column. Bifid spinous processes of the cervical vertebrae. Some stuff happens with the thoracic, but if it looks like a giraffe's head, I know that that's where I'm at. Lumbar vertebrae are a bit different. These are the largest and strongest vertebrae. They have the most weight to support. The entire rib cage, the upper limbs, the lungs, the intestines, the heart, the brain, the skull, all of that weight is supported by the lumbar vertebrae. And unfortunately, other than their beefy structure, there aren't really unique features that we can pull out that associate only with lumbar vertebrae. There might be one or two, and I'll show you on the next slide a couple things that you could use to differentiate these from other vertebrae. But it's not good news so far. There aren't many special structures that we can use to discern which vertebrae these are. They're generally quite beefy, so that might point you in the right direction. One thing that will help is if you take one lumbar vertebra and you look at it independently, if you've been keeping track as you've gone down the vertebral column, the articular processes have been pointing backwards, have been pointing posteriorly. All of a sudden, at the lumbar vertebrae, they point medial. So the lumbar vertebrae are really good at keeping the vertebral column lined up and centered over top of the subsequent vertebrae. They line them up side to side towards the middle, whereas the thoracic and cervical vertebrae, the facets pointed front and back. So that's one feature that we might be able to use. And you can imagine if I took this and turned it horizontal, these are the superior facets of one lumbar vertebra. They would articulate with the inferior facets of the lumbar vertebra just above it. These are pointed inwards towards the midline, so it helps to prevent them from sliding left and right. Make sure that center of mass or all the weight is centered directly over the bodies of these vertebrae, which is really important. There's a lot of weight to support. But I guess that's a pretty good defining feature. You could just take that and run with it. Or, what does this look like? Yeah, I hear it. Moose head. Absolutely. If that doesn't look like a moose, you're crazy. So, medially pointing articular surfaces, sure. Or it looks like a moose. I think it's these things that do it. Whatever you call that on a moose. So you've got cervical, you've got thoracic, you've got lumbar, no problem. This table is in your notes just for reference if you want to compare the structures, compare the general proportions. When you draw them out and you put them side by side, it's pretty clear there's a number of differences between these vertebrae. If you were given one to manipulate or handle, or a picture of one, you'd be able to identify it pretty clearly, I think. Now, these are all the loose or independent vertebrae in the vertebral column. But it's not the end of the vertebral column. The sacrum and the coccyx are both vertebrae and part of the pelvis. It's the posterior part of the pelvis or the pelvic bowl. We're going to get to that later. And they're made from independent vertebrae that fuse during development. So the sacrum is the next most inferior section. The sacrum is the large, widened, triangular shape that's made of 5 vertebrae that fuse during development. And you can see the points where they fuse. There are ridges that separate each of the sacral vertebrae. And while in an adult this is one bone, this is the sacral bone, you can separate out where S1 would have been, S2 would have been, and so on and so forth down the line. There were 5 vertebrae that fused together in development to make the sacrum. So depending on your count, we have there are 24 vertebrae so far in the cervical region, thoracic, and lumbar. You could count this as 1, and then the coccyx as 1, making 26 in total. Or you can count these independently, S1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They were independent and they fused during development. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about the sacrum just yet. When we get to the pelvis, these openings are going to be a bit more interesting. They're passageways for various nerves that go to the lower limb. But for right now, we're just focused on the structure of the bone. I do want to highlight that you don't often see the sacrum alone or independent. It's not removed from its points of articulation with the rest of the pelvis very much. On the sides, the lateral aspects of the sacrum, these articular or the auricular surfaces, they look like ears. Auricles are an old Latin word for ears, I believe. These points articulate with the ilia, which are hip bones that form the majority of the pelvic bowl. So you don't often see these separate. There are bones that usually protrude or extend out laterally from the sides of the sacrum. And that is the remainder of the pelvis, which we'll touch on later on. The sacrum, part of the vertebral column, 5 vertebrae that fused in development. Further down, the tailbone, or the coccyx, much smaller, also triangular shaped. 4 vertebrae would have fused in development. In some individuals, these can be loosened on impact if you fall while skating or sit down really hard on a hard surface. You can break or dislodge pieces of your coccyx or your tailbone, and if they heal improperly, it can be incredibly painful. There are a lot of different muscle attachments down here that can tighten and change the orientation of these bones if they ever get loose or dislodged. But generally, these should be fused in a full-grown adult. You can see 4 what would have been independent vertebrae that have fused in development. Certainly no weight-bearing aspects going on here. These are very small and they don't allow passage of anything. They are just, let's say, a vestigial remnant of development from when we once had a tail. So some muscles some muscles attach there, but otherwise there isn't really much of a role of the coccyx in our current function. We'll take a look at what muscles attach there when we look at the pelvic floor. It's actually really important that muscles do attach there. One of the big successes of the pelvic floor is that stuff doesn't fall out all the time. So attaching to the coccyx is really important in that context. And now, as far as we're concerned, we have a pretty good grasp on the structure of the vertebral column. We spent a lot of time talking about the spinal cord and the spinal nerves previously, and now we can superimpose that on our understanding of how the vertebral column is set up. You can understand that the vertebral foramen, that hole in the middle of each vertebra, allows passage of the spinal cord. And the spinal nerves branch out laterally. You got a really nice view to the intervertebral foramen at every level of the spinal cord where the spinal nerves would emerge. This is a great picture. You can see how the inferior articular surfaces of one vertebra and the superior articular surfaces of the next create this passageway for nerves to pass through. So we understand the vertebral column, but the thorax is more than the vertebral column. I'm going to round out the thorax before we end for the day, and the only thing left in the thorax is a discussion of the rib cage or the thoracic cage. The vertebral column gives the posterior support to the thoracic cage. The thorax is made up of the vertebral column posteriorly, the ribs laterally and anteriorly, and the sternum most anteriorly along the midline. So the thorax is this entire the entire thoracic region, the chest region, not the abdominal region, which is below this, you know, your abdomen, where your intestines are. The entire thoracic region or chest region is the thorax. The bones that comprise the thorax are 12 pairs of ribs with their cartilages, the sternum in the front, and of course, the vertebral column posteriorly. We've covered that at length, so we're just going to introduce the ribs and their points of connection before we call it for the day. So, if we have the vertebral column posteriorly, the complementary structure on the anterior surface is the sternum. The sternum or the breastbone. Fairly easy to palpate. You can feel it really easily. It's very superficial. There aren't many muscles that cover the sternum. Muscles attached to the sternum, but laterally, and you can feel all the different points of the sternum and hear them through the microphone, apparently. There are 3 main parts that you should know about the sternum. The upper portion is the manubrium. It's a thickened rounder portion. The body is unassuming, and then there's a pointed region inferiorly called the xiphoid process. The xiphoid process is a really useful landmark for putting on heart rate monitors when you get to XFIS. When you need to put a heart rate monitor on, or maybe in your personal lives, where do you put it? Around the thorax at the level of the xiphoid process. You know exactly where to put your heart rate monitor. So the cartilages of the ribs will articulate with the body directly. We'll talk about those in a second, but some other interesting features. The manubrium has a couple notches that you can feel. Let me just jump ahead real quick. The suprasternal notch is the one that you can feel just below your throat. There's a little rounded divot at the very top of your breastbone. That's the suprasternal notch. There's one down the midline. And you can use that as a landmark to find the clavicular notch just to the side of it. Now, you can't really feel a notch just to the side of the suprasternal notch. There's a couple bumps and things like that, but just move your arm forward while you're palpating off to the side. Can you feel the clavicle, which is off to the side moving? It's articulating in the clavicular notch. I should really take a video of this. It looks great. Stationary point is the manubrium. At the clavicular notch is where your clavicle will articulate. So that's what we care about as far as the breastbone is concerned, or the sternum. Other than that, it's an attachment point for the costal cartilages, which are the anterior projections of the ribs. Now, I'll just briefly go through how the ribs are set up. We're not going to look in depth at the ribs, only to say there are 12 pairs and 3 categories of ribs. The first 7 are true ribs. What does it mean for a rib to be true? All ribs attach to thoracic vertebrae, so that's not what distinguishes a true rib from a non-true rib. True ribs will attach directly to the sternum through their costal cartilages. The costal cartilage is cartilage associated with the ribs. Costal is the prefix that refers to the ribs. The cartilage will project from the rib bones directly to the sternum. So 1, 2, 3, all the way through 7 ribs. 1 through 7, highlighted here in red, are true ribs. You could also call them vertebrosternal ribs, vertebrosternal ribs, because they connect between the vertebrae and the sternum. Or you can call them true ribs. If they're not true, they are false. False ribs don't connect directly to the sternum. They still have costal cartilages, but those cartilages connect to other cartilages. They don't connect directly to the sternum. So ribs 8, 9, and 10 are false ribs, whose cartilage you can see here highlighted in blue. They don't connect right back to the sternum. Instead, they connect to the cartilage of rib number 7. You can probably feel that, actually. What you can't feel are the floating ribs, or the floating ribs, 11 and 12, that don't have costal cartilages that connect to anything. They're left posteriorly in the thoracic cage, and I don't really think they serve much purpose, even as far as muscle attachments. Not connected to the sternum, floating ribs, no costal cartilages, easy to identify in that respect. So true ribs, false ribs, floating ribs. We saw how they articulate with the thoracic vertebrae already. I'm not going to go through that in depth. When we come back to class next week, we are going to look at the muscles that keep this system together, allow you to stay standing, flex, extend, and rotate. Have a wonderful weekend.